Sasquatch, the anthropology of the unknown.
I think the real debate is between the academics and the amateurs, in a sense. That is, the people who really love the hobby of Sasquatch, and academics who tend to be skeptical on most counts anyway. Academics are almost always from Missouri, and I think academics in the conference have been demonstrating that.
Yes, the academics get to give their papers and have their fees paid. They pay no fee to be here. The amateurs and non-professionals pay cash.
I'm a very cynical person, very ruthless and very nasty when it comes to the Sasquatch investigation. And
why do you say nasty?
Well, you know, an investigation is a nasty thing. You dig around people's background, you think the worst of everybody you encounter. But the nice people don't hurt you, but the bad people do. So
what has happened?
The Politics of Sasquatch is the third of 5 programs based on a rather unusual conference on humanoid monsters held at the University of British Columbia in 1978. It is prepared and narrated by Radio Canada International's Susan Lumsden, who attended the controversial sessions on that elusive Pacific Coast creature known as Sasquatch or Bigfoot.
No sooner had delegates laid down evidence for the existence of the huge ape-like monster of the Pacific rainforest than the conference divided into hostile camps. As you might have gathered from the edited skirmish at the beginning of the program, there was not only a debate between the academics and the Sasquatch hunters, but there was even a more heated tiff between groups of hunters about the purity of their evidence and purpose. Jon-Erik Beckjord, the middle voice in the opening skirmish, was literally wedged between the two groups. As a non-academic, he found little support from the university professors. As a new hunter who founded his organization named Project Grendel after the monster in Beowulf, Jon-Erik Beckjord was resented by the veteran hunters like Rene Dahinden. Beckjord's Seattle, Washington-based organization had film evidence, which was excluded from the conference, while Dahinden's was shown twice. Dahinden's was the so-called Patterson film, one of the leading pieces of evidence for the Sasquatch. It was shot by the late Roger Patterson and is now copyrighted by Dahinden. Beckjord explains this apparent prejudice against him and his Sasquatch film.
I think perhaps it's a question of a pre-examination period that the new materials have admittedly not gone through. The Patterson film has been examined by many people, and many comments by scientists have been made about it. The new material is practically out of the camera and has not gone through this, and the conference was thought to be a good place to start this process. So possibly it was a reluctance to take a chance on the unknown, even though this is a conference of the anthropology of the unknown. I think there are some contradictions there, but I am not in a position of power to do anything about it. I'm just having to flow with the tide. It's better nevertheless, to have a conference like this, even with difficulties, than to have no conference at all.
As well as showing his film, Jon-Erik Beckjord wanted to tell the conference about his particular encounter with a Sasquatch. Radio Canada International was a more willing audience.
Well, it was approximately my 200th or 300th trip down the same road, past a garbage dump where I'd say maybe 30 sightings have been made in several years, and I had usually expected or hoped to see something on this road, and I often prepared myself to be very attentive as I approached the dump itself and going by, in hopes that I might surprise something. And on this occasion, though, I was rather disgusted and disappointed, and I was thinking more in terms of what to select on my grocery shopping, when I observed up just before the garbage dump on the skyline of the road, because the road did drive up over a hill, in silhouette was what I assumed to be a local Indian boy, teenager perhaps, hitchhiking. But as I got closer in my car, I saw very rapidly that this boy was not wearing clothes, and he was doing a nervous kind of shuffle, a rhythmic boogie that I did not feel was a human kind of movement. And when it saw me approaching, it then walked across the road in several large strides, and it had an exaggerated arm swing. The arm swing was almost up, was indeed horizontal, even with horizontal, if not above, and disappeared into the bushes. But the way it walked, the way it stood, and the way it walked convinced me that the rhythm that I was seeing was not something that a human being could duplicate, even if they were trying to. Furthermore, it was all black, hair covered black. I could see no clothing of any kind. I did not notice any kind of protruded mouth or snout like you'd expect to find on a bear or a dog. And of course, this was on two legs at all times, and I'd estimate roughly 6 feet tall, rather slender. And I ascribe that to being the fact that it was a juvenile or an adolescent of its species, whatever species that may turn out to be. And on stopping the car, I saw nothing whatsoever except lots of woods. The path very rapidly became congested, and it was obvious that anything that went through there would have to get down on all fours very quickly to get through. And I found what could have been a heel print, but nothing more. As far as further activity went, I just continued doing what I had been doing, which was recording stories of people who had made sightings, just like you're recording mine, and making a collection and then trying to see what elements were in common.
So far, it seems that Jon Beckjord's fledgling Project Grendel was doing quite well without the academics. I asked him if he really needed them.
Depends on what you want to accomplish. If one of your designs is to obtain funding for research, then it is helpful to get as many academics as possible to vouch that the thing you are looking for is worth looking for in order to get funding. On the other hand, usually the funding is given to academics who, most of which are not willing to spend time in the field. Very few, with the exception of Dr. Krantz, very few of them are willing to actually spend time in the field, even if they did get the funding. So it becomes a rather catch-22 sort of situation. Well, as an example, I met a biologist who was very seriously studying prairie dogs. And I suggested that maybe it might be more interesting to study a higher primate that is unknown. And he expressed himself this way. He said, number one, I can get money to study prairie dogs. I can't get a dime to study Sasquatches. And number two, I know prairie dogs are there. I don't know if Sasquatches are there. And I suggested to him that perhaps if he took a risk, he might get great rewards. But he didn't agree with me. He opted for the security, which is what most scientists do. They are interested. The majority of the scientists I've met are more interested in security, the security of their position, than they are in sticking their neck out, such as such brave men as John Napier and Grover Krantz, to advance knowledge, and which I think is really against the scientific tradition. My concept of a scientist is someone who advances the frontiers of science, even at personal risk. And many of the scientists I've met have much in common with bankers.
The one scientist at the conference that Jon Beckjord admired was Dr. Grover Krantz of the Department of Anthropology, University of Washington. As John Green is the eminence grise, or gray eminence, of the field investigators, so Grover Krantz is the most respected of the academics. We've turned the remainder of the program over to him, alternately as he was heard in the conference, and also in private interview about his career with the elusive Sasquatch. First, Dr. Krantz, as he addressed the conference.
Okay. The paper I've written is titled Sasquatch Believers versus the Skeptics. And I'm going to be able to read my entire paper because it's quite short. I'm not going to zero in on anybody in particular here. You just sort of, if the shoe fits, it's your problem. Okay. There are many people who believe that there is a species of giant, hairy hominid, or something like that, living wild in the forested mountains of western North America. There are also many people who are equally convinced that there is no such animal except in some people's imagination. Well, I'm going to here alienate almost everybody by attacking both positions. With very few exceptions, those who hold a firm opinion on this matter, either way, are doing so without adequate knowledge. The scientific establishment is overwhelmingly on record as denying any reality to the Sasquatch. This is not surprising. Science is not in the business of investigating the unknown, but only in working out minor details in what is already accepted. The Sasquatch, if proven, would certainly be something new. Science has a vested interest in its own infallibility. So, to find out that it has completely missed something as big and potentially important as the Sasquatch would be to admit a certain degree of failure. It is easier for the scientific establishment to deny the existence of such creatures than to look for them. Having denied their existence, science then becomes obligated not to look for them and can no longer avoid the issue by claiming ignorance. Must just flatly deny the whole thing. Now, science, as establishment, is made up of scientists and of their accumulated knowledge and their institutional traditions. The individual scientists often have as much faith in their disciplines as religious people have in theirs. To suggest their discipline is guilty of a major oversight, compounded by a deliberate effort to ignore the matter, is to threaten the foundations of scientific faith. Small wonder many scientists actively oppose Sasquatch investigation. Its success would leave many of them without the infallible rock outside of themselves to hang on to. And believe me, they hang on to it. Many scientific breakthroughs are made by amateurs or by those only marginally involved in the field in question. These new ideas are first regarded as heresy by the establishment, but eventually become accepted when more authorities look at them with open minds. On the other hand, the vast majority of new ideas turn out not to be true. We read about those few which worked, but we know little about the 99% that were and remain foolishness. One of the tasks of the scientific establishment is to weed out these heretical ideas and to accept only those few which are true. The trouble is that after debunking 99 silly ideas, it's easy to get into the habit and miss the next one that may be true. The more unlikely a thing may seem, the more proof is required for its acceptance by science. I think this is reasonable. The Sasquatch is certainly more unexpected, hence presumably more unlikely, than a new species of chipmunk. The proof required in this case is an actual specimen. Nothing else will suffice.
Okay, I had read a number of accounts, but I wasn't quite certain what to make of them. I wanted them to be true, but I didn't think they were. But I read in a newspaper account of a sighting in western Washington, which required 300 miles drive to get to. And I was able to talk to the man, a deputy sheriff, and his description made sufficient sense. I knew that if he was telling the truth, he could not have been mistaking any human, bear, or anything like that. And
Well, why could he not have mistaken it for a bear or whatever?
okay, it took 2 steps or to cross 1 lane of a good-sized road, and that's beyond the leg length of any human being and substantially beyond the leg length of any bear. And also the physical description, a flat face and broad shoulders, removes it from a bear.
So this intrigued you enough to pick up the search in earnest?
Well, it encouraged me a good deal, yes. And since then, I think I've talked to pretty nearly 30 people who claim to have seen these things. And I believe about half of them. And I've seen footprints now on 2 occasions, which was a little bit of an unsettling experience, even though I was pretty satisfied that they were real. To encounter them still is a bit of a shock.
Why?
Well, they're big, 18 inches long, and at least the best set that I saw, and so deeply impressed in the ground, and then just by experimenting, I knew that they weren't hammered into the ground. They were pressed in gently. I studied them at quite a great deal of length, and the impact of the whole situation of an 800 to 1,000-pound animal walking slowly along on 2 feet is rather... well, it's a surprise. I'm sure I'm in for still another surprise when I actually see one of the animals.
The scientific establishment, I think, rightly demands that this proof be produced before it can be taken very seriously. But the establishment also refuses to look for this specimen and actively discourages those who would. Research funds are given to projects which are certain to produce usable results. Sasquatch hunting is a long shot in which negative results are of no value. Now, there is a large amount of evidence presently available, as you all know now, presently available which supports the existence of the Sasquatch. Unfortunately, much of it is not reproducible because it is in the mind of the observer. Any scientist could have gathered the evidence that I have, but every scientist could not. I might explain that. After 50 or 100 people have looked over a set of footprints, they are destroyed in the shuffle of human feet and fingers. Photographs and plaster casts can record them, but these are one more step away from the original, and their authenticity can be and should be questioned. Eyewitnesses can be interviewed, studied, cross-examined, but only by a handful of curious scientists. Very soon they will decide to shut up or else change their stories. To be a little more detailed on that, if I talk to somebody and I'm the third person to interview them or the 10th person, I might get a story. If one of you goes out and catches the same person and you're the 25th, you might get nothing. Everybody can't do it. Okay, after they've changed their stories or shut up, then all further accounts are again one more step away from reality. A taped interview is not sufficient because it could very easily exclude the parts where the participants were laughing over their hoax. It's very simple. You tape record something and you just bust up with laughter, cut the tape, run it back, catch, okay, that's where I started laughing. Then you go with a serious straight face and you fill it in again. Tape recordings are not very dependable there. Okay, very few scientists have been willing even to look at or listen to the information that is available. Of those scientists who are willing, only a small fraction have actually had the opportunity. Mostly this is because they fear for their scientific reputations if it became known that they were interested in such things. Upon questioning, most of the established authorities will assert that they have never seen any evidence that supports the existence of Sasquatch, obviously. Those scientists who know nothing about the matter ought to honestly admit that and not present an uninformed opinion as though it had some validity. There are a lot of people I'm talking about there who are not here, so you can relax. Now we come to the other half. The true believers are also generally as uninformed as the skeptics. Reading a few books and articles with a favorable view towards the Sasquatch hardly qualifies one as knowledgeable on the subject. The Sasquatch enthusiasts are notorious for the way they accept and repeat stories without any attempt at verification. My own experience suggests that the probability of truth of one account is cut in half for every human it passes through. For example, what an eyewitness tells me is only about 50% probable. If I hear it from an intermediary, it's dropped by another 50%, hence it is 25% probable. If there's another intermediary, it drops in half again. Many believers pay only lip service, I think, to this kind of precaution of getting to the original source. I'm reminded, and I'll step on a toe or two here, the infamous Bermuda Triangle is probably the finest example of how such unchecked stories can be magnified into something that seems real. In this particular case, the Bermuda Triangle, this is solved by simply showing, as several people have, that there was never any mystery in the first place, only unverified fabrications.
Can you describe to me your series of professional experiences that led some of your fellows, as I take it, to consider you part of that lunatic fringe, and what was the particular unpleasantness surrounding your association with the Sasquatch?
The problem really began in early 1970 when I had a chance to examine a particular footprint, and I decided at that point that the animals were real. It was my opinion, and for a few months I was very uncertain what to do about it, and finally I decided, yes, I not only think they are real, I'm willing to tell anybody. At that point, my reputation began to get very wobbly, and pay raises and promotions were remarkably slow in coming, even though my regular work in anthropology is, I would say, considerably in excess of most of my colleagues. But they don't like to have me talk about it. Now this, of course, I'm speaking for most of them. Most of them feel very uncomfortable having someone with my opinions around.
How is this discomfort made manifest? Does anyone ever talk to you, any of your colleagues, and said, look, old boy, you need a vacation, or I think you've gone bonkers, or something like that?
Well, they don't say anything like that seriously to me. I'm bigger than most of them, well, all of them, so that tends to make them polite face to face. But they've realized that I get a kick out of this whole subject, so they can joke with me. And usually I can sense who's joking for fun and who's joking because he really means something behind it. But most of the information I get secondhand when some student or another faculty member will come and tell me, hey, so-and-so just dropped an interesting comment about you. And most people, a lot of people like me enough that they'll inform me of these things. So I get just this background noise of what's going on behind my back, but I usually pay no attention to it.
Yet your professional life has been, well, has it been severely altered? You were talking about cuts in pay or failing to get a promotion that was expected and that sort of thing. Has your other research work and your other field been limited in any greater way than what you've described?
I'm not sure if it has. I've done reasonably well. It's always possible that some papers I've offered for publication might not have been published because of this, but then again, maybe they weren't published because they weren't good enough. And I really have no way of checking on that.
Have gathered stories of monsters from almost all parts of the world, evidently under the impression that this strengthens the argument for the existence of the monsters. Actually, it does just the opposite. The more widespread a land animal is claimed to be, the less likely it is to be real. A truly worldwide distribution occurs only for man, his parasites, and his domesticates. Claims of multiple species might avoid this problem, but only raises another. For science to have missed one large species of unknown primate is difficult enough to accept. To claim that there are still more only strains what credibility there is to the breaking point. I might add parenthetically, if it is shown that there is one monster primate out there that we've missed up until now, then it might be very pertinent to look for others. But if you're going to start talking about 5 or 6 species of primate now, you don't expect any support from the establishment. They will just laugh you out of the place, even worse than if you are talking about one. Well, anyway, much potential support from individual scientists who might take a neutral view is lost when the enthusiasts bring in these irrelevancies. They may or may not be irrelevancies, but they often are. I am reminded particularly of an otherwise very excellent newspaper article on the evidence of the Sasquatch that was unfortunately destroyed by the writer's reference to a petrified heart that he examined. Hearts don't petrify. It was a very excellent article. Any scientist who read it would just get to that part and then say, that's out. Now, the enthusiasts may criticize me and others for not looking into these reportedly related aspects because they just might be important. Well, I'm not working on finding a cure for cancer either. It does not follow that I favor that disease. One can only do so much. Other anthropologists have been attacked for not investigating the Sasquatch phenomenon at all. In their defense, it must be said that they can't work on everything they're interested in. Does it follow that every scientist who is not working on food production wants people to starve? Certain conservationists have taken up the cause of protecting the Sasquatch and favor extending the various laws which prohibited or seem to prohibit shooting one. These local laws are intended mainly to protect innocent bystanders, including farmers, cows, lawmen, rather than the Sasquatch itself. Protecting an unverified species is rather silly at this point, and I don't think it makes any more sense than protecting unicorns. If and when a specimen is taken and the existence of the species proven, then serious legislation should be considered. Some have argued that we are dealing with an endangered species. We touched on this last night. And that the killing of one specimen might lead to their extinction. Well, I keep asking, if they become extinct without ever becoming known, what difference would it make? Lots of species have become extinct without man knowing about them. Well, in any case, there is no reason to think that the Sasquatch numbers are declining. And there's some evidence, admittedly speculative, to suggest that they are actually increasing. If there is an ecological danger from human activities at present, then proving their existence by killing one might lead to investigations which would possibly save the rest of them. But general public acceptance without an actual specimen is not very realistic. I keep reminding people that medieval Europeans believed in unicorns, and this didn't accomplish anything. By this kind of reasoning, we might say we should also pass laws to protect gremlins, werewolves, leprechauns, fairies, goblins, trolls, angels, and all the rest of them. I'm not, in so doing, putting my own opinion to say that the Sasquatch is in the same boat with the rest of these creatures, or reported things, but in a good deal of the public, in most of the lawmakers, the Sasquatch is in that boat, and trying to argue with them is pointless. The burden of proof, however, is on the believers. Until a specimen is produced, the skeptics will continue to hold the field. It is possible to prove something exists by producing it. The reverse is not possible. One does not prove a non-existence with positive evidence. Unfortunately, both sides argue strongly from what they want to be true rather than what they know. Wanting something to be true is a good reason to follow a particular approach, but wanting something to be true does not constitute any evidence that it is true. That works only in children's games and religion. At present, those who have not thoroughly investigated both sides of the problem of Sasquatch's reality, I think honestly ought to admit that they simply don't know. Thank you.
You have been listening to Dr. Grover Krantz of the University of Washington, one of the anthropologists who attended the Conference on Humanoid Monsters at the University of British Columbia in 1978. This program, The Politics of Sasquatch, was the third of 5 programs entitled Sasquatch, the Anthropology of the Unknown. In the next program, a psychologist offers an analysis of Sasquatch Believers. This series on the Sasquatch was narrated and produced by Susan Lumsden with the assistance of Elizabeth Janes. Technical direction by Michel Depassier in Montreal for Radio Canada International.